The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Manuel. I am the Program Director for Driver Fitness, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Lost in Translation, Roadside Stops with Foreign Nationals. Our presenter today is Lieutenant Eric Riley from the Virginia State Police. Lieutenant Riley has served with the Virginia State Police for 16 years. He began his career in Northern Virginia and served there as a motor officer, responding to the Pentagon on September the 11th, 2001. Shortly after, he was promoted to sergeant in Southwest Virginia. In 2005, he was promoted again to first sergeant as the area commander, where he served until his promotion to lieutenant in the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in 2007. Eric is a graduate of James Madison University and has attended the National Criminal Justice Academy through the University of Virginia. Eric currently serves as the field lieutenant in the Culpeper Division and oversees the operations of 6 area offices that comprise that geographical portion of the state. Right now, we'd like to ask everyone to place their phones on mute during the presentation due to the background noises during the webinar. We also would like to ask if you have any questions. There's a button on the webinar that allows you to raise your hand, or you have the option to type your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. If you're having technical issues, you can't hear or you can't see the screen, reach out to Diane Graham through the question section on the webinar screen. The question section of your webinar screen, at that time, we'll do our best to resolve that situation. And right now, I'd like to turn it over to Lieutenant Riley.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this presentation today to discuss the important topic of dealing with foreign nationals during roadside stops. I am Eric Riley, and I will be going through the presentation. And as Tom said, if there are any questions, we'll certainly try to get you those answers towards the end of the presentation. The roadside stop of the foreign national is a growing trend, and it's an issue that really affects every officer throughout the country. It's not a regional or local issue. Patrol officers around the country have either experienced in the past or will likely experience at some point in their career a traffic stop involving a foreign national driver. This foreign national may or may not speak English, and if there's a language barrier, it makes the identification process through foreign documents even more difficult. When faced with this type of situation, an officer may become frustrated or determine that it's just easier to give a warning than to try to sift through confusing documentation for someone who may or may not return to court or honor the summons. Now, as Tom mentioned a moment ago in my introduction, I began my career as a young state trooper in Northern Virginia. This is an area that borders Washington, D.C., so I regularly came into contact with foreign national drivers, and most of the time I was presented with documents that I was not familiar with. And as a young officer, the first few times that I was dealt with this situation, it was confusing and frustrating and when I was trying to accurately determine who I had stopped. So this really became the genesis of the foreign national driver's license resource card and the PowerPoint training that we're going to go through today. And a little bit of background, in 2010, a working group was established by the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA, under a grant from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This consisted of subject matter experts from across the country in the fields of motor vehicle administration and law enforcement. And this group looked at what is likely to occur when an officer stops a foreign national driver and what, if any, additional training and resources would assist that officer in completing the traffic stop. So the goal today is to discuss the product that was produced from that working group. And one of the things the group identified as needed was some type of tangible resource that could be placed in the hands of a roadside officer that could be utilized on a daily basis. And that represents the resource card for contacts with foreign national drivers, which we'll talk about in a moment. Additionally, we also will reference some training opportunities that agencies can offer their officers that can expand their knowledge of documents that they may come into contact when faced with this situation. And I will mention the caveat now, and I'll reference it again as we go through the presentation. It is recognized that an officer's discretion and intuition take precedent in these situations. Nothing in this presentation is intended to imply that an officer should or should not do something. These are simply best practices that have been identified by the working group that created the documents that can help an officer navigate contact with a foreign national, and the result being a very thorough and equitable end to the interaction. As I mentioned earlier, the product that was produced is the resource card for foreign national drivers, and we'll go through that in just a moment. But to describe a little bit about why the group felt it was important and some of the components that the group felt officers would be dealt with when they come into contact with a foreign national, I'll touch on those. And really there were three major components that go into an officer's contact with anyone they've had stopped, but certainly with a foreign national driver. So why is it important that we have this discussion and that we try to create a best practices model for officers to gather information with who they have stopped? First and foremost is officer safety. And as I said, this holds true with anyone an officer has stopped. But the sooner an officer can identify the individual that he or she has stopped, the safer it is for everyone involved. Most foreign nationals are in this country lawfully and have no criminal motive or intent. But recent history has clearly shown us that there are individuals intent on entering the United States illegally and for furthering illegal goals. Another component to interaction with a foreign national is the equitable treatment of violators. If an officer stops someone who lives in Bethesda, Maryland, that individual should be treated the same as someone who lives in a foreign country. The decision about enforcement should not be affected by subject's nationality or any other issues associated with their identification. A foreign national should receive the same treatment as would any citizen. And also, when we talk about the equitable treatment or result of contact with a foreign national, it's incorrect for an officer to assume that there will be no consequences for a foreign national if he or she is issued a summons. You know, as I mentioned a moment ago, my experience, you know, is when I started off as a young state trooper, is it easier to give a warning to this individual who's likely not to come back to court? That is a misnomer. There are consequences that we'll discuss a little later when it comes to foreign nationals receiving a summons or the enforcement action that an officer takes against a foreign national. And the third component that the working group examined is terrorism prevention. And this obviously has taken on a whole new meaning in the post-9/11 world. But by correctly identifying foreign nationals, an officer can determine whether that individual is a person of interest to any other government agency. Information sharing and databases have been linked in a far greater way since 9/11, and an officer's contact with a foreign national can be invaluable to other federal, state, or local agencies who are looking at that individual as a person of interest. NCIC checks are linked to the terrorism watch list, so if the officer has a hit, they can be provided information about what the interested agency would like done, whether they'd like it noted, have that person detained, or whatnot. And obviously, if a foreign national is arrested or involved in a criminal or terrorist act, investigators can go back and research that individual's movements preceding the incident through law enforcement contact. And a good example of that is one of the 9/11 hijackers who was stopped by Arlington County Police Department in the days preceding that attack. So there are advantages to contact with law enforcement that can be examined. So the training objectives today, what we're going to try to do is discuss the resource card and how it can be used to navigate or work through a traffic stop involving a foreign national driver. We'll discuss the way to use the resource card and its intended use, and we'll become familiar as well with some of the documents that an officer may encounter during a roadside stop with a foreign national. Also, as I mentioned toward the end of the presentation, we'll also direct you to some training opportunities through AMBA that can even further expand officers' knowledge of this growing trend and the documents that are likely to be presented with a foreign national. So this, as you see on the screen now, is the resource card for contacts with foreign nationals. And as we progress through this presentation, we'll kind of break this thing down as to how it can be used. And if you look at the screen, you'll see 4 separate diamond-shaped green diamonds. Each of those represent what this card is intended to do. And what it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is not intended to dictate to the officer what to do. It's simply intended to help that officer gather sufficient information to determine who they have stopped, accurately identify that person, and then make the appropriate decision about what type of enforcement action needs to occur. And if you follow this flow chart, as you progress through it, the goal is to get to one of the green diamond-shaped portions of the resource card. And once that officer has reached that, that should offer them sufficient information to make a determination about what they want to do. So we'll go through this kind of step by step, and hopefully you'll see the advantage to following these best practices. First and foremost, again, with any individual that's stopped, but certainly no different with an international driver, the officer is going to ask for a driver's license. And this is the one document that must be present for any foreign national driver to operate a motor vehicle in this country. The additional documentation that we'll look at and examine can corroborate that individual's identity, can certainly assist the officer in gathering additional information, but the foreign national driver's license must be present to operate a motor vehicle in this country. It's the one document that represents that authority. Obviously, there are many different kinds. You can see the one here is an example from the country of Germany. Some states, currently 12 in the United States, require, in addition to the international driver's license, or I'm sorry, the foreign national driver's license, in addition require an international driving permit. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later here is another myth, the international driver's license. There is no such thing. That is a novelty item. The international driving permit is exactly what you see on the screen. It's a translation of the foreign national driver's information into English, and it can assist the officer in gathering that information. But the foreign national driver's license, the license issued from the individual's home country, is what is required to operate a motor vehicle in the United States. If that is present and you are an officer in a state that does not require an international driving permit or IDP, then you should or may have sufficient information to decide whether or not you want to issue a summons, a warning, or what other action needs to occur. If you're in a state that requires an IDP, and we'll talk more about which states do in a moment, but if you are in a state that requires an IDP, then that's another document that can assist you in deciding whether you have sufficient information. And if they have produced those, that will take you to a section of the resource card that allows you to take appropriate enforcement action. If for some reason they either don't have that information, or again, the officer's intuition tells them to ask for something additional or investigate further, you can consider asking for a passport. Any foreign national that's in this country is likely to have a passport from their home country that allows them to enter this country. It establishes what their citizenship is, any visas, entry stamps. It'll give the officer information that might be relevant to that stop. In addition to a passport, the officer may consider asking for or looking for a I-94 visa. There are variations of this. On the screen you see a green copy, which is issued to visitors who enter the U.S. under a waiver. There's also a white one, which is a visa for individuals who enter the country, such as tourists, students, or workers. In addition to the I-94, they would have a arrival or departure record, which would be attached, and that would also indicate how long the bearer is allowed to stay in the United States and what the terms of admission were. So again, these are documents that may be present, and they can certainly corroborate the individual's identity. If for some reason they don't have that, or again the officer feels they need to investigate further, you could consider asking for a permanent resident card, and you see an example of that on the bottom right, and or employment authorization card, which is also shown on the screen. These are two documents that, again, can be referenced. They're going to be issued through the United States. They're going to be in English, and they can corroborate that individual's name, date of birth, other information. If you still don't have sufficient information or none of these documents are present, the officer is going to most likely consider investigating further. First and foremost, the department's policies and state laws should be adhered to. Most agencies, again, in a post 9/11 world, utilize some form of a suspicious activity report that can be vetted through investigative branches of that agency. Links to NCIC will access databases for information sharing. Most states are covered under a fusion center. Those centers have a wealth of resource and investigative ability to assist in identifying people, or any other investigative resources that the officer may have access to. And again, it goes back to an officer's intuition and discretion. Most foreign nationals are here legally and are moving about in this country for legitimate purposes, but the officer's intuition may indicate a need to investigate further. On the reverse side of the resource card, you'll see on the screen is an example of some of the documents that may be encountered during a roadside stop. We've talked about some of those, but this is something that the officer can look at, can reference, and ask for. They may or may not be present, but they certainly can corroborate that individual's identity. At the top left of the screen, you'll see the circle with a line through it. This is one example of something I mentioned earlier, the international driver's license. Again, it's a novelty item. There is no such thing. It is not a valid document, and if an officer sees this, that should be an indication that there needs to be additional investigation conducted. There's plenty of examples of these on the internet, and they can be obtained are readily available. But this represents a fake driver's license. Again, the only document that allows an individual to drive, a foreign national to drive, is that foreign national driver's license. And that is the example just below in the left center. Again, the example of a German license. Below that, you'll see the international driving permit, which we discussed a little earlier, which translates the foreign national driver's information into English and will provide that officer with good information. At the bottom here, you'll see the map that indicates the 12 states that currently require the international driving permit, and we'll talk about those in just a moment with a better slide. If that is required, that needs to be present in addition to the international driving or the foreign national driver's license. At the top center is an example of a permanent resident card. As I mentioned, this is something that permits an alien to reside or work in the United States. It does have an expiration date. It must be renewed. But this is something that an alien covered under this would have to carry, and it's something that an officer can consider asking for if they need additional information. In the center of the document is an example of a green I-94 visa. This is the waiver form that I mentioned earlier, and it will indicate why the individual was allowed in the country, how long they can be here, and again, what are the terms for their admission to the United States. Top left is an example of a foreign national driver's passport. This one happens to be from the United Kingdom, but obviously the primary purpose of any passport is to permit someone to enter another country other than the one they're a citizen of. And information that can be gleaned from this obviously is, any entry stamps, where they might have come into the country, how long ago that may have been, any accompanying visas, other information that may assist an officer. Below that is the employment authorization document or card. Again, this is issued to foreign aliens who are permitted to work in the United States for a specified period of time. And at the bottom here is another example of a visa that would be valid for entry into the United States for a temporary period of time and for a specific purpose. Most often these would be individuals such as tourists on vacation. Here's the map that we looked at in a smaller scale just a moment ago, and it does indicate states that currently require an international driving permit, those being New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Indiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Utah, and Idaho. So in other words, the majority of the states across the country do not require an IDP. The only thing that's required is the foreign national driver's license. That doesn't mean, though, that the foreign national did not enter the country in New Jersey and rent a car and then drive to Florida. So if an officer who is patrolling Virginia or North Carolina comes into contact with this individual and they're unfamiliar with the information on the license and the individual has limited English, it may be beneficial to ask for an international driving permit. It does not mean it's required, but it might assist the officer in identifying accurately who they have stopped. So a few myths. Some of these we've already touched on. The international driver's license. There is no such thing. That is a novelty item. It represents what's tantamount to a fake driver's license. So that is a myth. There is no international driver's license. Again, the document that must be present is the foreign driver's license from the home country, and if required, an IDP. Another popular myth is don't bother issuing that foreign driver a summons because they're probably not going to come back for court and not going to pay the ticket anyway. That may be true. They may not return to court and they may not honor any fine. But there are reciprocal agreements, and we'll touch on those in a moment through some training. But there are reciprocal agreements. There's reciprocity with a number of countries for foreign nationals who have law enforcement action taken against them in this country. It may bar them from reentry. It may cause them consequences upon their return to their home country, but there are reciprocal consequences to law enforcement action for foreign nationals. Some of the additional training resources that the working group identified that can be provided through AMVA, the fraudulent document recognition training, which is a wonderful course. It really breaks it down through the whole gambit. You can access training for a roadside officer that really deals with just recognizing documents that are commonly found or readily available, both fraudulent and authentic. You can also expand some of that recognition training all the way up to the forensic level. Some of the anti-fraud initiatives that go into creation of these documents. So it can be beneficial to a roadside officer all the way up to a forensic technician. So this FDR training is really wonderful. The Foreign Reciprocity Resource Guide is something I touched on just a moment ago. Again, that can provide some great information as to specifically what might be consequences or reciprocal agreements with other countries for foreign nationals who have law enforcement action or interaction while here. And again, at the bottom, the International ID Checking Guide, you can access that as well through the link below, and that offers information as well on foreign national drivers. For copies of the resource card or the PowerPoint training, you can access AMVA's website and download it for free. This information was provided to each of the law enforcement agencies across the country, but if an officer or a supervisor would like to provide more copies or obtain any of that, that is a good link to obtain that. And here is the composite of the Foreign National Driver Working Group. And we thank each of them for their time and their expertise in the creation of these documents and this training. Again, this was about a 2-year program under the direction of AMVA and NHTSA. And, you know, I will go back to the caveat I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. This really represents best practices. This is not intended to dictate to an officer how to handle a traffic stop involving a foreign national. It's simply intended to provide a model to navigate that contact, to gain the sufficient information to decide what would be the appropriate enforcement action. The officer's discretion and intuition are always precedent. So if there's any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them now. And Tom?
I'm here.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I'll just go ahead and let you know that the PowerPoint and the actual recording of the webinar will be available on the AMVA's website within the next 24 to 48 hours. So you can go to the webinar link on AMVA's website, and we will have the PowerPoint presentation and the the video, this recording as well, available to you on the AMPA website. So we want to thank Lieutenant Riley and Tom today for being a part of this with us, and we thank you all for joining. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Lieutenant Riley or reach out to Tom Manuel